talking about milk pricing at the 2023 Ohio Dairy Producers Association annual meeting. And I think in order to understand milk pricing, you have to have a master's in livestock agriculture, political science, and applied economics. Guys, am I right? Luckily, we have some experts to talk about this with the American Farm Bureau, Dr. Roger Cryan, Chief Economist, and with the National Milk Producers Federation, Jim Sleeper, consultant with them, helping them through this process. And before we get into your work together and some things we've done all over the country, let's start with what exactly the Federal Milk Marketing Order is, Roger, and why is it so complicated?
It's something that's grown over decades and decades. We would never have a system as complicated if you built it from scratch. But each change has had a purpose, and whenever I sit down and try to figure out a fundamentally better way to do it for the benefit of farmers and for the folks that they feed, I can't really think of it. The system does a couple things. It makes sure that there's a sharing of revenues across markets. It allows products to be sold at market prices, and it makes sure that farmers get paid on time and a price that pretty much matches what their neighbor gets paid.
And Jim, it has been quite a while since we've taken a look at the Federal Milk Marketing Order. 23 years now. Time for a refresh, in your opinion?
Yes, absolutely. So what we're National Milk Producers Federation is looking at, we've been having ongoing meetings talking about how we can modify or modernize the Federal Order program. The last significant change would have been the year 2000. So we think it's time overdue where we need to really modernize it to the current environment, because things have changed the last 23 years. Milk supply, milk production areas have changed, plants have closed, the intake of milk in terms of a lot more milk being consumed in the hard form in terms of cheeses and versus fluid milk and so forth. So we're taking a good hard look at those recommended changes to modernize the Federal Order program to hopefully benefit dairy producers in the future.
One of the biggest steps to getting reform out there, or at least some ideas about reform to the Federal Milk Marketing Order, was a forum in Kansas City, Missouri back in October. You guys were both part of that with your organizations. We'll talk about that forum in a bit, but first of all, Roger, how important was it to have all parties involved here? We had a lot of people in the room that can make a big difference in what we're going to see in the future.
Yeah, it was a great meeting. We had some processors, co-op staff. We had mostly farmers. That was what our board wanted. They wanted to make sure that it was primarily attended by farmers, that it represented farmers across the country, a real cross-section, and farmers that were members of Farm Bureau and National Milk and the Ohio Dairy Producers Association and a whole lot of organizations. We invited a lot of organizations to participate, and for the most part they came out.
A lot of recommendations came out of this, Jim. We looked at classes. We looked at the reason for FMMO. We looked at ways to move forward and simplify the process. What were some of the high-level bullet point recommendations that came out of this meeting that we all can agree on?
I'm assuming you're talking about the Farm Bureau meeting in Kansas City. Let me emphasize what Roger said. There's been a groundswell of taking a look and doing a deep dive within the Federal Order program. And the Kansas City meeting that Farm Bureau hosted provided just an excellent opportunity of all those stakeholders, because it's more than just for dairy farmers. It's also for the processors, the academia, and so forth. And I couldn't agree with Roger anymore. But during that particular session, it was really beneficial to listen to all of those stakeholders. And we came up with some very good recommendations. A good example is changing the Class 1 mover, how that is formulated. There was a lot of discussion on several of the other topics and how should we tackle this complicated make allowance issue. There were other areas that were very beneficial for Farm Bureau to move forward in their policy, but also for National Milk to be part of that as well, where we enjoyed it, being able to sit across the table with the Farm Bureau individuals, as well as the dairy farmers that represented Farm Bureau and the other stakeholders. So it's a way to educate all of the stakeholders in this industry where we need to move forward.
You know, we talk a lot about these two organizations, American Farm Bureau, National Milk, coming together for this meeting, but Roger, equally as important, getting farmers from across the country. This isn't a countrywide answer. Milk pricing is very regionalized.
That's why we have regional federal orders, but a lot of the elements of the way way the milk is priced in those regions is national. What we're talking about is a national hearing on the price formulas that will set the foundation for allowing for those regional differences in constructive ways. And you asked about what are some of the conclusions that came out of this thing. And so the producers who led that meeting came back with ideas like make a class 1 price that goes back to the higher of. They want adjustments to the class 1 differentials to update and modernize things. They're willing to see the make allowance that's allowed to processors to be increased if the data proves it. And it's also important that we have an audited mandatory plant cost survey so we can do that. Otherwise, we can't have faith in the numbers that go into making those adjustments. We also came back, they came back advocating for things like modified block voting for federal orders, which is a very good compromise between those folks on one end that want to get rid of block voting altogether and those folks on the other end that say, no, this is strictly a marketing decision that only co-op should have. It gives room for folks to support their co-op, and if they really have to say no, they can say no. We have a whole list of things, and most of them, an awful lot of the stuff that was on the list for the forum either already was or ended up in Farm Bureau's national policy budget.
So all the stakeholders got into place, they all made some decisions, and now we have a unified voice to head into try to recommend these changes at the federal level. So what's next?
Well, from Farm Bureau's perspective, what's next ideally is the legislation that would authorize USDA to collect that plant cost data, because we don't believe that we can support any make allowance increases if it's not based on that. We've begun talking to some folks up on the Hill about how that can be accomplished, and we believe that National Milk and IDFA have both expressed support in principle for that. And if we're really lucky, we can get something done relatively soon, and we can all move forward in lockstep on a package. It seems to us that IDFA has kind of pulled back on supporting a larger package of changes that would, on balance, be good for farmers, because they recognize that this cost processing survey, this processing cost survey isn't authorized yet. So they're looking now for what they need, what they think they need, and not necessarily supporting a full package of changes.
Jim, as Roger just mentioned, time is of the essence here. 2023 is busy enough because we're working on a farm bill. Is this something to be part of the farm bill conversations, or is this something that's added on to, and do you see it happening here this year?
Well, I think the most important part is one of the reasons why we're here together. We need a thorough education. We need to get all stakeholders involved and educated on it. In terms of National Milk, our next process is to finalize all of our recommendations. We have 6 of the 7 recommendations totally approved by our board of directors. We're working on the last one here. Within the next 30 days, it will be approved. Once that occurs, then we'll have all 7 of them that we are ready to ask the USDA for a national hearing. Now, some of those recommendations we're going to have to work through, and a good example is what Roger indicated, through either farm bill or legislative ways. But those are the areas we are finding really good agreement amongst the parties. As Roger indicated, IDFA as well as Farm Bureau and National Milk, I think we're going to be able to go lockstep in a hand in terms of working together to ensure, and a good example is that make allowance, ensuring USDA gives us sufficient reliable data so we know how to update the make allowances on a more reliable and consistent basis going forward. So our view is we want to go to the national hearing, request the hearing here, not too distant future. We would expect the USDA then to issue a hearing, but before doing so, most likely they will have pre-hearing conferences where they educate producers and whoever else stakeholders want to be involved. But they'll also give us an opportunity to provide a forum for a national hearing in which everybody can then provide their testimony and their exhibits and their justification why we need to modernize the federal order program.
Still a lot of work to do, but we've got some heavy hitters in the room trying to make it happen for dairy producers, not just in Ohio, but across the country. Jim Sleeper with the National Milk Producers Federation, Dr. Roger Cryan with the American Farm Bureau Federation, their chief economist. Appreciate you both being with us on the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. We mentioned that forum in Kansas City, and coming up next, we'll talk to 4 Ohio producers that were in Kansas City making those big changes and those recommendations on behalf of the American Farm Bureau, Ohio Farm Bureau, and the National Milk Producers Federation and Ohio Dairy Producers Association. That's coming up after this.
Find out how Nationwide Agribusiness can help you grow your business. Get to know the people with the experience and knowledge to help you. Whether you are looking to protect your farm or ranch from the ground up, or need someone who understands your changing commercial ag needs. Find out how to better manage the risks of your ag business, or how quickly you can get back to business. Learn how you can protect your next with Nationwide on your side.
Quite a group joining us here at the Ohio Dairy Producers Association annual meeting. All 4 of these guys were in Kansas City, Missouri for that federal milk marketing order forum we talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast. Joining us from my left to right, Carl Steiner, Roger Baker, Carl Wiedemeyer, and Eric Grimm. And before we get started, I want people to get to know you. So let's start with you. Kurt, just tell us about you and your farm.
Yeah, I have a dairy that's north up here by north of Worcester up in Creston. I've milked 650 cows. I have the pleasure of having my 2 sons back on the dairy farm, Christian and Zach, along with my wife Robin. So dairy policy and that is important to me because of the future of our farm.
I'm Roger Baker. I'm a farmer here in Wayne County. I'm on the Ohio Farm Bureau Board, and I don't milk cows, but the dairy industry is vital to my economic viability. Of course, I live here in the county, and it's the largest dairy concentration in the state. So I have bled for the dairy farmer my entire life, and I believe that Ohio Ag pivots on the success of the future of Ohio dairy industry.
And I'm Carl Wiedemeyer, and my family farms in Marion County, where we milk about 200 cows in a partnership with my parents and younger brother. And I also serve on the board of Ohio Dairy Producers Association, and just excited to be here and share our story.
And I'm Eric Grimm. My wife and I have a small dairy farm in southern Lorain County, which we now have children and grandchildren involved, and I'm also the dairy forage specialist for Dollar Seed Marketing.
Roger, you mentioned that you work with dairy farmers on a daily basis, and so you hear about these issues. You hear about the issue with milk pricing almost every time you have a conversation with dairy producers, and that's why making these recommendations and having this meeting in Kansas City was so important.
Yes. So I raise a lot of forage, and I market to the dairy industry, and I'm on dairy farms every week. And number one, they are vital to the industry, to the ag industry, and to my future. But I've always had a heart for the dairymen. It's a tough job. They spend hours on the farm, and sometimes they feel hostage to the price of their product. And so I have made it a passion of mine to promote the dairy industry for the dairymen themselves, but the success of the dairymen is success of Ohio agriculture. And the program that AFBF sponsored in Kansas City and ODA, Ohio Dairy Producers Today is carrying on, is what I think in my farming career, one of the first steps that I've seen in a true advantage of the producers actually be able to get involved in the process.
Yeah, Carl, the one thing I heard after this meeting was something like this needed to happen years ago to get everybody together to have these tough conversations.
Yeah, I think the goal of the meeting was really to bring everybody's ideas and their ability to have their voice and bring those farmers together from all over the country. And I really think it helped bring a little more of a consensus to this milk pricing reform that we're looking at, and getting farmers all on board around kind of the same policy that we can move forward from here out.
Carl, I mentioned, Kurt, how complicated milk pricing is. I mentioned you have to have a master's in political science and applied economics and animal agriculture just to get it figured out. Can you give us a perspective from a dairy producer's point of view, why FMMO is complicated and some of the pain points you have with the current program?
Well, I think one of the things that came back to my dairy in 1994, Ty, and nothing's really changed since 1994 to now as far as the knowledge and the understanding of the milk pricing program. And it's one of the most frustrating things having another generation coming behind me is the boys will ask, well, Dad, how does the milk check figured out? And you sit down and try to explain it, and it's sort of unexplainable. And I don't think there's too many people in the industry would say, it's like we heard this morning, it's not like a corn and soybean market where you kind of know your inputs, you know what you're getting for your product, and you just accept. It's just a very complicated thing. So for me, my trip to Kansas City, and what I appreciated about it was there's a lot of talk about simplicity in the program, trying to understand it better. I looked today around the crowd of the dairymen that are here and from northern Wayne County here. There's a lot of young guys in the group that are 25 to 35 years old that unfortunately don't understand how they're selling their price of milk. So, Ty, if we can just get some simplicity, some of the programs that they're talking about as far as the reporting of what's going on, I think little things like that are going to help. Some of the bigger picture items that they start talking about, I'm not even sure I understand. But that's for the guys, the economists, and them to put together, or trust in our Farm Bureau for representation. But I'm happy to know that all these conversations are taking place.
Eric, the one thing that stands out to me is that FMMO hasn't even been looked at since 2000. Think about how many things have changed on your farm as far as economics go in the last 23 years, let alone the last 5 years, everything we've been through in our economy. And obviously those changes happened to your farm, it didn't happen to the price program.
Yeah, that's correct. And so can I just backtrack for just a second?
Sure.
So I really appreciate Ohio Farm Bureau sending us out there, the leadership that took place to allow us to do that. This was really eye-opening trip for me. And yeah, I mean, our farm has had to adapt. Our county used to have 90-some licensed dairy farms. Now there's less than 10 probably. So in order to survive, you gotta kind of ignore the pricing part of it, if that's a good word to use, and adapt other practices to include, things that are lower cost of production. And it's not easy. And as somebody coming from the outside world into agriculture and actually producing milk, it was a real learning curve, because in an industry, you know what you're going to get paid, you know what you're going to produce in the day and how you affect that. And the day-to-day stuff on a farm, it's hard, and it takes a very special person to understand how to put that animal language into production practices, if that makes sense.
Next question is for both Carl and Roger. I want to get your point of view from your respective organizations. As much as we are talking about everything that got done down in Kansas City, there was a lot of work to be done. Each organization has our own set of policies given to us by our members. So Roger, I want to start with you. How difficult were those conversations? And it wasn't everybody on the same page right away. We had to get from point A to point B, and it took a couple days.
So, yeah, there was a lot of information coming at you. They had the best. They put together panelists that were the best in the country, and a lot of people that have been in this industry for a long time. They took a long time to explain some things, but we had tough conversations. One thing that I see, I don't milk cows, but what I see from the outside looking in is you have the processors and you have the milk producers. And the processors want to make margin, and the milk producers want to survive and make some money too. And sometimes that collides. And so some of the people that represent these farmers that are, and I'm not going to mention, all the names of the organizations, but that represent these farmers that bring this whole federal order of pricing together, sometimes they're on the processor side, sometimes they're on the marketing or on the producer side. And so we had to ask questions in that room that you had to double down on a few of those guys and pinpoint some things. And it wasn't always a relaxed situation, but that needed to happen so that the whole industry, from USDA right down to the farmer, and everybody in between could see that process take place. And then, you know, Farm Bureau took it on to their board and American Farm Bureau and to the delegate body in Puerto Rico, and Ohio Dairy Producers has come alongside, and so it's made for a good. I think it's made. We're in a spot that the industry's never been in before now. Where it lands, we're yet to see. There's one thing I would like to mention, Ty. You haven't asked me this question yet. Maybe you're going to, but from our Ohio Farm Bureau members, how this kind of got started for us. Our past president, Frank Burkett, who's here today, is a dairyman. And he served as president of our organization when the dairy business was in the tank. And I was hearing a lot of pressure. And I was putting pressure. 6 o'clock in the morning, I'd call Frank and say, we got to do something. And we'd drive to board meetings, we got to do something. And so Frank said, we're going to do something. And he started pushing at AFBF for, let's have a conversation, let's see what we can do on reform. Then Brandon Kern come along and picked up the Ohio Dairy Working Group. And Brandon took that and invited anybody in the dairy industry, and we kept having these meetings from time to time virtual. It was kind of through COVID. And then AFBF, you know, Brandon worked with his colleagues at AFBF, and so this all came together and then circled back around and brought farmers like these three right here, dairy farmers, an opportunity to go to Kansas City to be with everybody else in the state. So why do I tell you all this? This is truly grassroots. We don't make this up. This is real. And it started with a president who was a dairy farmer in Stark County of Ohio Farm Bureau, and now it's bringing along sister organizations and everybody from the farm gate. So I think we have to remember that, especially when it comes to membership time, that like all these organizations are advocates.
Yeah, and Carl, you bring a unique perspective because you're very heavily involved with Ohio Farm Bureau. You also sit on the board of the Ohio Dairy Producers Association. You see the contrast in some opinions, but how surprised were you we got out of Kansas City with as many agreements as we did with those recommendations?
Yeah, so just to kind of echo what Roger was saying, I mean, through Ohio Dairy Producers Association, a very similar path that Ohio Farm Bureau took to, you know, bring together through our board, getting information and working through this process, and kind of culminating in, you know, Ohio Dairy Producers Association sending me out to Kansas City to join these guys. And going back to your question, I think all four of us standing here can really say from that meeting that, yeah, we were able to come to some consensus around many of the points. And I think that was pretty surprising to me, actually. I was afraid that I was going to Kansas City and I wasn't sure whether I was going to see pitchforks and torches or not. But, you know, it was a great meeting and we did get consensus, and that's really what we need. We need, you know, ODPA, Farm Bureau coming together and kind of agreeing on the main policy points so we can try to see if we can get this thing over the finish line and do what's best for our members in both organizations and all dairy farmers of Ohio.
Eric, a lot was covered. What was your takeaway from the meeting in Kansas City?
Well, it was a lot. And it's always fun to travel with Roger.
I'm sure it is. I have before. It's always an adventure.
I had to put that in, right? You know, looking forward with a guy also that has kids and grandkids involved in farming, we do need some kind of very simplified pricing formula so that everybody understands what we're getting paid. You know, the consensus of the consumer today is we still milk cows by hand, and we haven't milked cows by hand for 60 some years, and a lot has changed in the industry. But a lot of good things have changed. We have a lot more products on the market now. We have very good products on the market now. And, you know, from organic all the way through conventionals and whey products and cheeses, there's just a myriad of products that aren't reflective in that federal order system that was put in place actually in the 1930s. So 100 years later, we need to update it, we need to modernize it and make some changes.
Hey Ty, can I make one comment? And that is, I went to Kansas City like the rest of them to learn. But the one thing dawned on me out there, and it dawns on me here today, and that is when an organization or an industry reach a certain level, it's time to address issues. And I think if we look at our overall United States dairy producer numbers are dropping fast. Class 1 milk, which is fluid milk people drink on cereal, is dropping very low. Now these are serious times in the dairy industry, and so when you hit a serious time and the right people get in the right room, a lot of the friction leaves because it's time to make decisions. You're no longer dickering, you're no longer bantering back and forth, trying to play poker with each other. It's time to do things. And I think we reached that point in Kansas City. I think we hear about it again today. And our product's doing really well. And when it's produced as cheese and whatnot, it's doing really well. I'm sure on Super Bowl Sunday, pizza, it's a really good product. It exports very well. But there are some issues, and we have to address them.
I'm glad you brought that up, Kurt, because your involvement in Kansas City and with Roger through Farm Bureau has led to involvement in a whole other level, in a whole other state. Tell us about recent appointment to a board and why you decided to take that next step.
Well, as times change in the industry, I was shipping my milk to Superior Dairy in Canton. A lot of milk from Michigan was coming down to Superior Dairy. Ultimately, Michigan Milk, the co-op, bought out Superior Dairy, where I ship my product. And in the last year, I've had a chance to watch the organization. I told you earlier, my two sons are back on the farm. It's allowed me the opportunity to take on a little bit more responsibility, and so I have accepted a position to be a director on the Michigan Milk Board. More to learn about where my milk's going, to learn about the whole process, but to also give an Ohio insight to that group up there for what happens there. Because we do have a unique market here in Ohio. A lot of cheese plants, a lot of places for fluid milk, and so we have some things that are different. I think that hopefully my experience with the Michigan Board will be a positive one for me.
Roger Baker, if that doesn't really emphasize the return on investment that Farm Bureau puts towards our members to better our position in certain items, but also to better our members to other elevation and other levels of boards and whatnot, that's a perfect story right there.
Absolutely. Kurt, he's a grassroots Farm Bureau leader. He came to the county board probably 30 plus years ago, worked his way up through as president of the Wayne County Farm Bureau, has been a leader. He's been on different sideboards and things that we've had over the years with Farm Bureau. Kurt has been on the Wayne Economic Development Council here locally. He's just been a leader in the industry and in the community. Then Farm Bureau comes along, invests in all of us. We do this in a lot of different commodities, not just dairy, but the Kansas City trip came. Things just kind of worked. It's like divine intervention, I guess. Things kind of worked out, and then now Kurt's going on to represent Ohio in the Michigan milk scenario. And I just say to all of Ohio Farm Bureau members, this organization is grassroots. This little discussion here proves it's grassroots. We work with other organizations, and here's an example of our members growing and getting into other states and helping represent us all.
The groundwork is now set. It's time for the heavy lifting. We are going to make these recommendations to USDA and hopefully get some hearings later on this year. And of course, it's a Farm Bill year too, so important timing for these conversations to happen and hopefully make some changes as far as the Farm Bill goes with milk pricing as well. Kurt Steiner, Roger Baker, Carl Wiedemeyer, Eric Grimm, our guests on the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. And we all have one thing in common. We've all traveled with Roger Baker, so I'm sure there's going to be some stories shared after this. And I appreciate you guys taking the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.